Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, The Man Crisis. Learn why so many men are struggling to find their way in an increasingly gynocentric world in The Man Crisis. Get your copy of The Man Crisis in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.
When I take a critical analysis of President Trump's border wall, it is financially impossible for this border wall to be built. Now, your President Trump has proposed that this border wall be built with $5.7 billion, and I can tell you from a public administration perspective, it's just not possible for this wall to even start being built with such little money. Now, anyone who understands public administration will tell you that a project of this magnitude would be something that is going to cost you several $100 billion, and it's going to take something in the course of about 40 to 50 years to build. Now, in contrast, here in New York, we had this 3rd Avenue L and 2nd Avenue L, I believe, and these elevated tracks were torn down back in the 60s and the 70s. And in the mid-1970s, they proposed to build a 2nd Avenue subway to replace the 3rd Avenue L and 2nd Avenue L in the 70s, and then have the 2nd Avenue subway be its replacement. Unfortunately, due to the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, all we got built was a 63rd Street tunnel that wasn't finished, and that tunnel, 63rd Street tunnel, didn't really get finished until 1999. And the 2nd Avenue subway didn't get back on track until the late 1990s, and it didn't get the first leg of it opened until about, I think, 2016. So that project to build a 2nd Avenue subway to replace the 3rd Avenue L and 2nd Avenue Ls, that project took 40 years to complete, and out of that whole 40 years, all we got was a 1-mile stretch that took us from 96th Street all the way to, I believe, about 72nd Street or 57th Street. I think it's one of them. And that's as far as we got, a mile or a mile and a half stretch of subway tunnels, and it took 40 years to complete that subway line. So if it took 40 years to complete a subway line, what do you think? How long do you think it will take to build this border wall, which is over 1,000 miles from the tip of Texas all the way to the end of California? So you have a 1,000-mile stretch of border, and your President Trump is proposing we're going to build this so-called wall with just $5.7 billion of public money. That's just not going to happen, because that little bit of money won't even get you started on an exploratory committee. Because when you understand how public administration works, you understand that $5.7 billion he's going to spend, all that's going to do is fund basically an exploratory committee, and that committee is just going to explore if this is feasible and if they can allocate resources for this every year, and how much these resources are going to cost every year to go build this so-called border wall, which they are proposing is supposed to be about a mile deep into the ground and about 20 to 30 feet high. So this concrete wall that they are proposing, this wall is not going to cost $5.7 billion, because again, it cost over several $100 billion to build a 2nd Avenue subway over 40 years, and it cost $6 billion just to create walls to deafen the sounds for the highways at $2 million per mile. So if you do the math, you will see that this wall isn't going to cost $5.7 billion. This wall may wind up eventually costing you $50 to $60 trillion, and it's going to take more than 40 to 50 maybe even 100 years to build. And the reason why it's going to cost so much to build is because when it comes down to public administration, the way dollars are allocated is completely different than the way money is allocated for business. So when you have a project like this, the money is usually allocated by a budget from the government, and you get your budget annually. So when it comes down to these type of projects, you're getting money on a budget, and you have to try to do things within the budget. And many times, many of these budgets wind up having cost overruns because the exploratory committee estimated things based on what things cost in the year that they were proposed. Like your Trump is proposing this in 2019, but the economy may change in 2020, 2021, 2022, and it's those economic changes that can lead to the cost of supplies being higher in the future, and that's what leads to these cost overruns. And you may even have periods of time where they don't even have the money to even budget for this so-called wall. So when I look at this whole wall argument, it falls completely apart when you look at the economics and you crunch the numbers as related to this border wall. There's no way that a wall is going to be built for $5.7 billion. And when you look at it, 1,000 miles of U.S. border, they just cannot be built with $5.7 billion. When you do the math and understand public administration, you understand that Trump's proposal is a complete farce, and it just is so completely puerile that it's just not funny. I mean, this is over 1,000 miles of border, and this wall would cost, again, at the minimum, at least $40 to $50 trillion just to build, and it would take at least 40 to 50 years to build it, because when you think about, again, the way the government takes time to construct things and the way they allocate money for things, the government runs on a very slow schedule. When has the government ever produced anything on budget or anything on time? And this is the critical question that most Americans never ask themselves regarding their government, because their government has had numerous projects like the Osprey helicopter, which was a complete disaster that went on for years and even decades with cost overruns. And they're not looking at the big picture as related to the government, because the government cannot really solve the immigration problem with a wall. When you take a critical look at this whole wall argument, it falls completely apart, because when it comes down to illegal immigration, most illegal immigration is primarily due to employers hiring illegal immigrants. And they hire illegal immigrants because they want to get cheap labor and they don't want to pay standard rates for American labor. And the main reason why we have a lot of immigration problems is primarily due to things like the H-1B visa program being abused by people like those on the left who work in information technology, who go out here and hire all of these Indians and Koreans and many others to work at their companies for lower wages, because an American IT worker will cost them $100,000 a year or $120,000 a year, whereas an Indian, a Korean, or a Chinese worker with an H-1B visa would only cost them $50,000 to $60,000 a year. So these IT companies, they abuse the visa program, and many of those people wind up either overstaying their visas from H-1B, or they wind up overstaying their visas when they call themselves going to college here in America and studying abroad. But the stereotype we have is of Mexicans trying to cross the border. So when we look at this whole border issue and this whole issue, the solutions to the problem are not building a wall. It is enforcing policy on employers who go out of their way to hire illegal workers and doing something about the abuses of the H-1B visa program. And the other thing we need to do is end the American welfare state for those who are not citizens, because if we end the welfare state for those who are not citizens, then these illegal immigrants have no reason to want to come here. So if you take away the economic incentives for illegal immigration that drive illegal immigration and give people incentive to be illegal immigrants, then they don't want to come here. Because when you look at the caravan of failure, it's very interesting that that Honduran caravan of failure passed Mexico. And the reason why they passed Mexico is because there was no welfare state. And because there was no welfare state, they wanted to migrate to America. So they're coming here for the welfare that is given to illegal immigrants, when welfare should just be for American citizens. So this is a simple policy change we can easily implement. And if we just simply implement these policies, we could see change almost immediately to the whole immigration issue. So when I look at this immigration situation and this stalemate between your President Trump and Nancy Pelosi, it is all political theater as I see it, because this wall is just not economically feasible, and this whole argument over the wall is one that is completely ridiculous. $5.7 billion would not pay for a wall, and $5.7 billion would not even start to pay for the exploratory committee to even consider a wall. And the project like a border wall, this wall would cost us, again, several $100 trillion, take 50 to 60 years or 40 years to even implement. Because, again, when we look at the 2nd Avenue subway, again, another state and federal project, it took 40 years for us to get 1.5 miles of a subway line. So if it took 40 years for us to get 1.5 miles of a subway line, how many years would it take for us to get a border wall that is over 1,000 miles? When you do the math, it just doesn't add up. And when you do the math, you see that your President Trump's proposal is a dead one on arrival, either now or with the next president, because the next president isn't going to keep funding a project that is an albatross like the Osprey helicopter project, because this project is a complete disaster and the proposal for it is a complete disaster. And when you look at the numbers and deconstruct the numbers for this border wall, it just shows how borderline lost many Americans are, and how they are so caught up in the emotional rhetoric regarding this border wall that they're not looking at the economic numbers for the border wall, and they're not looking at the whole economic situation. So many Americans are polarized based on emotion that they can't see the facts, and if they saw the facts regarding this whole immigration issue, they would be telling their legislators to start going after employers. But people aren't going to go after those employers because the rich benefit from cheap foreign labor, and many of these people with the welfare state benefit from illegal immigration, because that's how they get their block grants funded for welfare. So no one really wants a solution to the illegal immigration problem. What they want to do is stop talking about the problem, and what they want to do is stop talking about the problem and argue back and forth. So again, they don't want to talk. They just want to argue back and forth, but they don't want to talk about the problem, and they don't want to solve the problem because they benefit from the problem. So when you look at this whole thing regarding this border wall, again, it just shows how lost we are and how many Americans want to be great Americans, but then they don't want to take any sort of great responsibility for their country. If you'd like to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to pick up some of my books like The Man Crisis, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.